I have a rule that after every big commission I complete, I take a little bit of time and make a plaything. Because, let's be real, commissions can be draining. To make a thing that has no consequences, that's just purely the joy of making things out of wood, is a way that I get to remind myself why I do this, why I love making things out of wood. And it just so happens that this little wall shelf I'm making is a fantastic skill builder for folks in the beginner to intermediate woodworking range. So, let's dive into it. So let's jump right into the project this week. I will talk about the design and how that developed and where it came from in a few minutes, but for our starting purposes, I'm going to start at the building of the thing. And the first step was to look through my scraps and see what I had available. And the truth is, I really, really wanted to find a way to use this olive because it's really a beautiful piece of wood, but there are just too many checks, too many voids, and I couldn't get enough material out of that without running into structural issues there. So I looked through some of my other scraps, some cherry, some oak, and eventually I found this piece of walnut. Now, this walnut is an offcut from a piece I did 2 or 3 years ago, so I've had it lying around for a while and haven't been able to figure out what to use with it because it's really pretty badly warped, but it has some beautiful, beautiful color variation to it, given the fact that it was air dried. And those are the kinds of things that you don't usually get from the kiln dried stuff that you buy at the lumber yard. So I took it to the saw, chopped off a couple inches, and made sure that there weren't any checks and voids that I couldn't see on the surface. And once I was confident of that, I cut it into 2 pieces, one for the top and one for the stem, so that I could start the milling process. Now you can see the cup on this piece is pretty substantial, and I want to try to yield as much thickness out of that board as possible. So in order to avoid all of that waste going up the dust chute, I milled it as close to final width as I possibly could. And this piece ends up at about 9 inches wide, so I think I cut it to 9 1/4, something around that range. For our metric friends, I know 260 mil is 10 inches, so a little bit less than 260. I don't know, we'll call it 240. And once I had that milled down nice and flat, I could joint an edge, I could take it to the thicknesser, and I could take all of my pieces down. Now you'll notice here I'm milling 3 pieces and not 2. That's because I always mill an extra piece so that when I set up my machines for my joinery operations down the road, I can make sure that I have an extra piece, the same dimensions, the same thickness as my actual work pieces. Sometimes I'll mill up an extra piece of poplar or an extra piece of cherry, whatever I have lying around. In this case, I had enough extra material out of that board that I just ended up milling more of that same material. Now with my pieces milled flat and square into final dimension, I can go ahead and mark out my hanging mechanism, which is nothing more than keyholes. And I know some people are going to squirm when I say keyholes because it's not necessarily the most popular hanging method, but just hear me out for a second. Let's talk about keyholes. Now, I am of the opinion that the keyhole is a vastly underrated hanging system. Number one, because it's just incredibly simple to execute. And number two, because you can hang all kinds of things with it. Like, for example, this tiny corner shelf that I made for my office, or a little bit larger of a hanging shelf, which you can see how thick that board is. Now, this ended up being my bar at my house. So you can see that it can hold a substantial amount of weight. And also, I've made shelves. Like, these are bookshelves that I made 10 years ago, which I just hung with keyholes, and they hold all of the weight of the books I put on them. So you can do a lot with keyholes. Now, there are innumerable ways to go about cutting your keyholes. You've already seen me do it twice in those brief clips where I did it with a handheld router or with a trim router. And in this particular instance, I'm going to do it on the router table because it's just the easiest way for me to do it in this moment. So you saw me mark out where my keyhole was going to start and where it was going to end earlier. And then I just set the proper depth. I set my fence to the center of the board. I drop it in place. I run it. I pull it back and I lift it up. That's all there is to it. And for the other one, I do the exact same process on the other side of the board. I don't flip it. I just move it to the other side, drop it in place, move it, pull it back, and lift it up. And then, once my keyholes are done, I can move on to the joinery for this, which we're using sliding dovetails. But before we talk about how to cut those, let's talk about where this idea came from. So my partner wanted a floating shelf of some kind for her apartment, kind of a bedside table, but without legs. And that's where this idea originated. And I wanted to develop a piece that we could make together in the shop. Something simple, something accessible to her. And I drew something up in SketchUp, and then we cut it out on the Shaper Origin, because the Origin is really good for kind of beginner woodworkers to just get that jolt of, hey, I did a thing and it's done. And that's important early on. But when we're making things on the Origin, doing a double stub mortise and tenon is not an issue at all. We already have the CAD files drawn up, so we can just upload it to Tool and get ripping. But if we're gonna do this sans the Origin, it actually makes no sense to do a double mortise and tenon. It's way more work to do that. And so that's where transitioning this into the sliding dovetail comes into play. It's much faster to join this as a sliding dovetail than it would be to do a traditional mortise and tenon. But doing a sliding dovetail on the Origin, where we did it originally, is a real pain in the butt. So here we are. Now, cutting a sliding dovetail is nothing more than cutting an angled dado. So I'm just going to set my depth of cut in my router, which in this case was a 1/2 inch, and use a straight edge to run the width of my dovetail across my piece. My upright is 6 inches wide, so my dado, or my sliding dovetail negative, is going to end up being about 5.5 inches wide. Now, once I've done that, I can put my same exact bit into the router table, and I can take that off cut I had earlier, and I can do a bunch of cuts. This is really just a guessing game. It's make a cut, see if it fits. If it's too tight, move the fence in. If it's too loose, chop that off, move the fence out, and keep going. And then just make sure that you go back and forth until you get a piece that fits together really nicely. And once you do, I mean, you don't even need any glue to hold this joint together, which is why it's perfect for knockdowns. Now, I do just want to point out the grain orientation of that upright piece right now, because I am an idiot and made a mistake in just a moment. So I just want you to make a note of that as we move forward. Let's keep going. So with my joint fitting nicely, it's now time to cut the front shoulder of this joint. Remember when I said that this upright piece is 6 inches wide, but my dado is only 5.5 inches or so? I need to remove that front 1/2 inch in order to let this joint seat all the way. So I'm gonna do that roughly on the bandsaw, and then I can come in with a chisel at the bench and just do all the final shaping. And here is where I want you to make a note of my idiocy, because you see how beautifully this goes together? And you see how different the grain orientation is from what I did just a moment ago? And I haven't even realized it yet, but it's right after this clip where I go, oh, oh, take your thumbs up and get out of here. But now that I have my pieces joined and everything looks good, I can start marking my curves. Now, right now I'm using an asymmetric curve bow, or an asymmetric drawing bow. And essentially what that does is allow me to make big curves on pieces. It's thicker at one end than it is at the other, which creates that asymmetry in the curve, which is a really useful tool to have. If you do curved work at all, you can still buy those over at Lee Valley. And then once that's done, I take my symmetrical drawing bow and I do the same thing on my top. It just allows me to make a curve that is essentially an arc or part of a circle. So now with my curves drawn on my pieces, I can go to my bandsaw and I can start rough cutting those curves. I'm going to work slowly. I'm going to work accurately, because the more accurately and smoothly I cut those curves now, the less work I have to do afterward with the cleanup, whether that's at the belt sander or with a spoke shave. So, that grain orientation it really, it hurts my soul, guys. You know how I feel about grain orientation, but hey, mistakes happen. This is a joyful project that I'm just making to make myself happy and enjoy woodworking. So it is what it is. It's fine. We'll make it through this together. Now I take my top over to my belt sander, which, by the way, if you need a tiny belt sander, I've had this rigid belt sander for a number of years and it's never let me down. It's very good for the money. Then for my interior curves, I can take my spoke shave and I can just go to town. And for this, I had to use a curved bottom spoke shave. If you don't own one, you can just use a sanding stick. There's so many different ways to go about treating these surfaces. But here's one main difference between the piece I made for my home and the piece that my partner and I made together, because I wasn't about to sit there and ask her to hand shape these profiles for, an hour or two. So instead, we just routed a chamfer on those pieces, and it looks good. It looks quite nice. She's very pleased with it. But if I'm doing a piece, you know how I feel about what I call dynamic edge profiles, meaning that the curvature of the piece can also influence how wide or how thick that chamfer is, and that just really changes the way that you perceive a piece, in my opinion. So hand shaping these edge profiles not only is a joy because I enjoy doing it and it makes me happy, but I think it also really can influence the way that a piece is perceived. It feels somehow fundamentally different when that chamfer goes from skinny to wide over the length of a curve than when it's all just the same width. I don't know why that is. It is different somehow. So I don't know. You can disagree with me if you like. It's just the way I feel. And if the point of this video is about the things that bring you joy and it's good enough as it is, then hand shaping an edge profile is good enough as it is. I don't need to worry about efficiency really, or hell, even getting the wrong orientation on the upright for the grain. Like it's all fine. The point is that it's a joyful experience to be able to make things out of wood. And ultimately, who cares how efficient you are? Who cares how good the thing is even? If you look back on it 5, 10, 20 years later and you go, oh, that was actually not very good at all. Was it the best you could do at that moment? Does it make you happy? Did it make you happy in the moment? If all of those things are true, then it's good enough. Now, with all of my pieces sanded, all of my profiles done, and now ultimately my piece glued up, which by the way, that's the simplest glue up I've done in a very, very long time. Now it's time to get a coat of finish on here. And I do just want to note, you see how black the finish is that I'm using? This is a variation on my kind of finish mixture, oil and urethane, but it's been tinted because it's walnut. And walnut's the only thing that I really ever tint. Usually I just use a clear coat on pieces, but because walnut gets lighter over time, it gets that kind of orangey color, similar to the way the sapwood is at the bottom of that piece right now. Sometimes I will put a tint in the finish in order to slow that process down. And in this case, it's just a couple of drops of medium brown trans tint, and you get a really lovely depth of color to it, but also it stays that nice warm brown, dark, deep color over the course of years rather than turning orange over the course of a decade. So once that finish is cured, then I can take a little wax to it and buff it out and make sure everything is smooth and pretty. And guys, look at that. That color in that figure really is beautiful. Like it's such a simple object, but the tone of the material itself is just, I don't know. It brings me joy. It brings me joy. And the polish on that finish, on that top, really is lovely. And now it's time to install the thing. And it really is a super simple install. This is part of the reason I love using keyholes. I just establish my height, which in this case is 36 inches. And I establish the distance needed for my keyholes, which is 12 inches. And then I make sure they're level and I drill a couple of holes in the walls. In this case, I did use a drywall anchor. Was it necessary? No, but I figured why not? I'm putting it on the internet. Somebody's going to yell at me for not using drywall anchors. And then I just adjust the depth of the screw until it seats properly. Make sure it's nice and snug to the wall, and bada bing, bada boom. That's all there is to it. And then it's just a matter of decorating how you see fit. And I happen to have this vase, which I've loved for years. It was my great uncle's, and it's just, I don't know. That form of that vase and the form of that shelf are just so lovely, both individually, and I love having those two together. So, and hey, if you're not into vases because you're too manly, here's a little something else for you. Maybe that makes you feel better. But thanks for watching, friends. And until next time, go make a thing. Cheers.